New study. The worst warming impacts avoidable if there is hope seen with 70% emissions cut. Catastrophe under as is scenario. So then, what would the world's temperatures and the planet look like in 2100 if greenhouse gas emissions continued as is, and if they were cut by 70%? Researchers at a well-known climate center asked those questions and used a computer model to conclude that it'd be catastrophic if unchecked. Again, catastrophic if unchecked, but manageable if the world could reduce gases by that much. This research indicates that we can no longer avoid significant warming during this century. We can no longer put this problem off. Said Warren Washington, the study's lead author. But if the world were to implement this level of emission cuts, we could stabilize the threat of climate change and avoid catastrophe. A computer simulation of the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, projected that unchecked levels would mean an Earth at least 4 degrees warmer, perhaps 5. But a 70% emissions cut would limit the increase to approximately 2 degrees. The study found somewhere in that range. Other projections, if emissions were cut by 70%, sea level rise due to thermal expansion from warming waters would be approximately 5.5 inches instead of 8.7 inches or more. But either scenario still projects significant sea level rise from melting ice sheets and glaciers. Arctic summer sea ice would shrink by about a quarter and stabilize by 2100 or before, as opposed to shrinking at least 3/4 and continuing to melt. Arctic warming would be reduced by almost half, helping preserve fisheries, seabirds, polar bears, and many other forms of wildlife. Significant regional changes in precipitation would be cut in half. The U.S. Southwest would not be as dry, not as bone dry, and U.S. Northeastern Canada would not see as much rain as under an unchecked scenario. Theoretically, the climate system would stabilize by 2100 or perhaps before, instead of continuing to warm or get warmer. The study, which is being published next week in the journal Geophysical Research Letters, is one of the first to use computer models to quantify how much of the effects of global warming can be avoided, compared to a world if nothing is done about the problem. If nothing is done in the as-is scenario, it could actually mean extinction on a global level. Global emissions still rising. While the study looked at what would happen with dramatic cuts in future emissions, history has shown that reductions are much easier to talk about than to make. The controversial 1997 Kyoto Protocol called for industrialized nations to cut emissions, but since then levels worldwide have gone up 25%. In the US, where emissions are up 6% in just the last decade, Congress is fiercely arguing over a plan to reduce pollution. Some say it will cost us a lot of money and will hurt the economy. Well, this country is already spending a lot of money. The economy is already hurt. And which is better? To worry only about today, or to have concern for the future generations of the world? What about the children? What about the little kids? What kind of world or earth are we leaving them? What kind of place will they inherit? An earth or a world where the weather is just so extreme it'll be very difficult just to have any kind of life? No, that's not going to work. Which is more important? If we follow on the path that President Barack Obama has outlined of cutting emissions by 70 or 80%, and the rest of the world does it also, then we can make a big difference on the climate by the end of the century, if not before. But if the United States and Europe cut back on carbon dioxide, and China, India, and other developing countries do not, then the world is heading toward a much harsher, hotter future. The study mapped areas that would benefit the most by emission cuts, comparing what would happen with less carbon dioxide and what would happen if greenhouse gases continue to rise or to grow. Alaska, Mountain West, vary most. In the United States, the difference between the two scenarios is starkest for temperatures in Alaska and the Mountain West, which would see temperatures rise a couple degrees less with emission cuts. In other words, there's going to be climate change, no matter what. One scenario is much worse. One scenario or the other scenario, well, it could be workable. Anyway, reduced carbon dioxide would also significantly lessen predicted future droughts on the Pacific coast and flooding in the Northeast. Much of Europe, Russia, China, and Australia would see the biggest temperature benefits from reductions in greenhouse gases, while the Mediterranean and North Africa region would benefit the most in predicted changes in rainfall from less global warming. If the world cuts back on fossil fuels, starting very soon, or actually immediately, it isn't going to be as bad. The study was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation, which also funds the Climate Center. And something related, yes, ice shelf bridge on Antarctica collapses. New cracks or rifts appeared along the Wilkins ice shelf. A day after the European Space Agency warned its demise was near, an ice bridge connecting a massive ice shelf to an island collapsed, sending hundreds and hundreds of icebergs out to sea. The beginning of what appears to be the demise of the ice bridge began this week when new rifts or cracks appeared and a very large block of ice broke away. The bridge helped stabilize the Wilkins ice shelf, and experts now fear that the entire shelf itself will start to disintegrate. over time, or actually could happen very quickly. Originally covering approximately 5,000 square miles, the ice shelf lost approximately 14% of its mass last year alone. That's quick. Very quick. In other words, climate change can happen very rapidly. And once again, there's something bigger going on here. And all these things are connected to the end times transition days. The transition is ongoing every day.